The gun was already cocked when Olive Wainwright stepped off the ferry and pressed the barrel directly against Isaac Dunlap's chest. She had not planned it this way. She had not planned any of it, not the 3 days she had been watching him from the eastern bank, not the way her hands had stopped shaking every time she crossed over to the western side and heard his low, calm voice ask her if she needed steadying. She had not planned to feel anything for the ferryman. And she had certainly not planned to stand here in the blue-gray light of a Kansas morning in the year 1873, with the Cimarron River rolling dark and indifferent behind her, and push a Smith & Wesson revolver into the chest of the one man she had come to trust. But the letter was in her coat pocket. She had found it that morning stuffed beneath the loose plank in the ferry's hull, wrapped in oilskin to keep it dry, addressed in careful handwriting to a name she recognized with the kind of sick, cold certainty that only comes when a long-buried fear finally surfaces. The name on the letter was Harlan Cobb, the man who had burned her family's homestead to the ground, the man who had driven her father out of Missouri and into an early grave, the man who had been hunting her for the better part of 2 years, and the letter was sealed with a wax stamp she had seen before, the kind the Cobb Land Company used, and it was addressed in care of one Isaac Dunlap, Ferryman, Cimarron Crossing. Isaac did not flinch. He stood with the morning mist curling around his boots, his dark eyes steady and unreadable, his hands open at his sides. He was 31 years old, and he had seen enough of the frontier to know when a person had genuine cause to be afraid, and he recognized it now in the rigid set of Olive Wainwright's jaw, in the way her gray eyes had gone flat and hard like river stone. "You want to tell me what you found," he said. It was not a question. The gun did not lower. "I want to know," Olive said, and her voice was quieter and more dangerous than shouting would have been, "why Harlan Cobb is sending letters to your ferry." The river moved. A heron lifted off the far bank and dissolved into the mist. Isaac Dunlap exhaled slowly through his nose. "If you let me reach inside my coat," he said, "I will show you something that will explain it, but I need you to decide right now whether you trust me enough to let me move." Olive stared at him. Everything she had built in 2 years, every careful wall, every learned suspicion, every scar that Harlan Cobb had left on her life pressed against the inside of her chest like something trying to get out. She lowered the gun by 2 inches. "Slowly," she said. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, thick with official creases, bearing the stamp of the United States Marshal's office out of Wichita. It was a warrant, and the name on the warrant was Harlan Cobb. The breath left Olive's body all at once. The gun dropped another inch, then another, until it was pointing at the mud between them. She looked at the warrant, then at Isaac's face, then back at the warrant, and for the first time since she had found the letter an hour ago, she felt something unlock in the rigid center of her chest. "You are a marshal?" she asked. "Was," he said. "Now I am a ferryman who is helping one." He watched her carefully, watched the anger drain out and leave something more complicated in its place. The particular expression of a person who has been forced to choose between 2 versions of the world and has just discovered they chose right. "You had better," Olive said at last, her voice rough and uneven, "tell me everything from the beginning." He nodded. "Then let us get off the riverbank," he said, "because if Cobb has a man watching this crossing, and I believe he does, we have already stayed too long in the open." She put the gun away. They walked together toward the small cabin he kept on the western bank, and the Cimarron River moved behind them, indifferent and eternal, keeping its own counsel about what it had witnessed that morning. It had witnessed, though it could not say so, the exact moment that something fragile and necessary began to form between 2 people who had each, in their own private way, been broken open by the same dark man and his hidden motives, and who were only now beginning to understand that they had both, separately and without knowing it, been circling toward the same ending. But to understand how they arrived at that particular morning, with a gun between them and a warrant on the table, it is necessary to go back 6 weeks, to the last days of September in 1873, to the moment when Olive Wainwright first appeared at the eastern bank of the Cimarron Crossing, and the ferryman first looked up and saw her. The autumn had come to southwestern Kansas early that year, stripping the cottonwoods before October arrived and laying a thin skim of ice over the shallows before dawn. The Cimarron River at the crossing point was wide and deceptive, one of those prairie rivers that looked shallow from the bank but ran swift and unpredictable in the middle channel, with a sandy bed that shifted without warning and had swallowed more than one wagon outfit whose driver misjudged the crossing. It was the only reliable ford between the Dodge City Road and the Texas border, which made it important, which made it busy, and which was precisely why a man like Isaac Dunlap had been stationed there in the guise of a ferryman 3 months earlier. Isaac had not been a ferryman before. He had been a deputy United States marshal out of Wichita for 6 years, working cattle theft and land fraud cases across the Central Plains, and he was good at his work in the quiet, methodical way that made him dangerous to the men he hunted. He did not look like a lawman. He was lean and dark-eyed, with the kind of unhurried manner that people mistook for slowness until he moved, at which point the mistake became expensive. He had a quality of stillness about him that the frontier seemed to produce in certain men, a stillness that came not from laziness but from long practice at waiting, at watching, at letting the world reveal itself without pushing. The assignment had come down from Marshal Totham in Wichita in August. There was a man named Harlan Cobb operating a land fraud scheme across 3 counties of southern Kansas and the northern Indian Territory, forcing small homesteaders off their claims through a combination of legal manipulation, threats, and when those failed, fire. Cobb was smart and careful and had so far managed to keep his hands clean on paper, working through agents and hired men. What the marshal's office needed was evidence of his direct involvement, and the key to that evidence was believed to be moving through the Cimarron Crossing in the form of documents and communications between Cobb and his network of agents. Which was why Isaac had taken on the ferry. He had bought it legitimately from the previous owner, an older man named Garrett who was ready to quit, and he had settled into the work with a practical efficiency that surprised him. The ferry itself was a simple flat-bottomed craft, wide enough for a wagon and team, guided across the river by a heavy rope stretched between 2 iron posts set into the banks on either side. He ran it from dawn until an hour before dark, charging a standard fee of 25 cents per person on foot, 75 cents for a rider and horse, and $1.50 for a wagon. He kept the rates fair and the ferry reliable, and within 2 weeks he had the trust of the regular traffic, the drovers and merchants and settlers and mail riders who used the crossing as a matter of course. He kept his eyes open. He kept his mouth quiet. He waited. On the last day of September, the weather broke cold and the sky turned the color of old iron, and a woman arrived at the eastern bank alone, on foot, carrying a saddlebag over one shoulder and leading a roan horse that was limping from a stone bruise on its left forefoot. Isaac brought the ferry across without being asked. He could see from 50 yards that she had been walking for some time, that the horse was in pain, and that she was the kind of person who would not ask for help, but would accept it if it arrived without ceremony. He tied the ferry at the eastern bank and began checking the rope without looking directly at her. She was perhaps 26 or 27, medium height, with dark auburn hair tucked under a battered felt hat and gray eyes that missed nothing. She was wearing a practical canvas skirt over heavy boots, a man's flannel shirt under a wool coat, and a holster at her hip that was clearly not decorative. She looked at the ferry, then at the river, then at him. "What do you charge?" she asked. 75 cents for a rider and horse, he said. "But if the horse can't walk, we load it differently. No extra charge." She studied him for a moment with those gray eyes, and he had the distinct impression of being assessed in a way that went beyond the ordinary. "That is fair," she said. He loaded her horse carefully, using a broad plank ramp that he kept for exactly this purpose, and he helped her settle the animal against the side railing without making a production of it. She watched how he handled the horse, and something in her posture relaxed slightly, the way it does when a person who loves animals sees another person who loves them too. "Where are you headed?" he asked as they moved out into the current. "Mead," she said. It was the county seat about 30 miles west, a practical destination. Nothing in her answer invited further questions. He did not ask them. He worked the guide rope and let the silence hold, which was one of the things he did well. Most people filled silence with talk, and talk told you things. But this woman was comfortable in silence too, and he found that interesting. When they reached the western bank and she began to reach into her coat for the fare, he stopped her with a small motion. "Keep it," he said. "Today is a light day." She looked at him steadily. "I do not take charity." "I know," he said. "This is not charity. I am adjusting for the horse's condition. If you had a horse that could walk, it would be different." He could see her deciding whether to argue. She decided not to. "I will remember that," she said. She led her horse up the western bank, and he watched her go with the precise, professional attention he gave to everyone who crossed his ferry, cataloging details without attaching meaning to them. Auburn hair, gray eyes, holster worn for use not show, comfortable with silence, headed to meet on foot with a lame horse. Nothing to connect to his investigation. Nothing remarkable. Except that he thought about her for the rest of the afternoon in a way that was not entirely professional. She came back 3 days later. The horse was still lame and she was still on foot, but she was coming from the west this time, returning from Mead or from somewhere she had been, and the saddlebag over her shoulder was heavier than it had been when she left. He brought the ferry across and loaded her horse without commentary, and she paid him the full fare this time, placing 3/4 in his hand with a precision that said she had thought about it. "You did not have to," he said. "You did not have to bring the ferry across when you saw me coming," she said. "But you did. We are square." He accepted this with a nod. On the return crossing she said, without preamble, "My name is Olive Wainwright. I will likely be crossing here regularly for a while. I prefer to pay my own way." "Isaac Dunlap," he said. "I will remember that." She nodded once as if this were a negotiation concluded, and led her horse off the western bank and disappeared into the cottonwoods heading east. He stood on the bank for a moment looking after her. Then he picked up the guide rope and began his afternoon work, and told himself that a woman with gray eyes and a practical holster, and an independent manner, was not relevant to the investigation he was conducting. He did not entirely believe himself. Over the following 2 weeks, Olive Wainwright crossed the Cimarron at Isaac Dunlap's ferry 7 more times. Each crossing added something small to what he knew about her. She was living in a rented room in a town called Becker, 8 miles east of the crossing, which was too small to show on most maps. She was making regular trips into the surrounding countryside, riding or walking to various homesteads in the area. She carried a small ledger in her coat pocket, and she wrote in it sometimes on the ferry, standing with her back to the side rail and her pencil moving quickly, and he respected her enough not to look at what she was writing. She began to talk to him on the crossings. Not extensively, not the way a lonely person talks, but in the focused, purposeful way of someone sharing information they have decided it is useful to share. She told him about the weather coming in from the northwest. She told him about the road conditions east of the crossing, which was useful to him. She told him once in passing about a family named Pickering who had been forced to abandon their homestead claim south of Becker, who had shown up at her door in the middle of the night with 3 children and nowhere to go. "What did you do?" he asked. "I found them a place to stay," she said. "And then I found out who made them leave." She said it the way you state a fact, without drama, but her voice carried something underneath it that he recognized as old injury, the kind of anger that has been living inside a person long enough to become architecture. "Did you find out?" he asked. She looked at him with those direct gray eyes. "I am in the process of finding out," she said. There is a land company operating out of Dodge City that is buying up abandoned claims for almost nothing. The families are not abandoning willingly. They are being forced. Isaac kept his expression neutral. His hands were steady on the guide rope. His heart had begun to beat with the particular focused rhythm of a man who has just heard something important. "That is a serious accusation," he said carefully. "It is a serious situation," Olive said. She tucked her ledger back into her coat. "The families do not have resources to fight it. Someone needs to document what is happening and put it in front of the right people." "Are you doing that?" She looked at the river. "I am trying." He understood then what she was. She was not a settler herself, not a homesteader, not someone passing through. She was something rarer on the frontier, a woman who had turned her own private grief into purpose, who was systematically documenting the same land fraud operation that he had been sent to dismantle. She was working the same problem he was from an entirely different direction, and she was doing it with the kind of quiet ferocity that comes from having personal stakes in the outcome. He wanted to tell her. He came very close twice on subsequent crossings. He wanted to say, "I am not only a ferryman. I have a warrant in my coat and information in my head, and I am working toward the same thing you are working toward, and we could be allies." He wanted to say, "You do not have to do this alone." He did not say it. The operation required secrecy. Cobb had men in unexpected places and had proven himself capable of detecting leaks before they cost him anything. Isaac could not know whether Olive was who she appeared to be, could not know whether her apparent purpose was genuine or constructed, could not risk the investigation on a feeling, however strong. So he kept his peace, and he watched her, and he charged her full fare, and the river kept moving between them like everything that was not yet said. What he did not know was that Olive Wainwright was keeping her own secrets. She had been born in Cooper County, Missouri, the youngest child of a farmer named Thomas Wainwright, who had built a decent life out of difficult ground. Thomas Wainwright was a stubborn man and an honest one, and he had made the mistake that stubborn, honest men often make on the frontier, which was believing that his documented claim to his land would protect it from the kind of men who knew how to use the law against the law. The man who had taken his land was Harlan Cobb. It had been 7 years ago, in 1866, when Olive was 19. Cobb was already operating then, running a smaller version of what would become his Kansas empire, and he had targeted the Wainwright farm because it sat at the junction of two creek tributaries that could be dammed to provide water to a larger operation. He had filed 3 overlapping claims against the Wainwright title, challenged the original survey, and engaged 2 law firms in a legal pressure campaign that her father could not afford to fight. When the legal campaign stalled, Cobb had sent men at night to burn the outbuildings. Thomas Wainwright had refused to sell. Harlan Cobb had burned the main house. No one had been killed in the fire, but Thomas Wainwright had taken a blow to the head getting his youngest son out and had never fully recovered from it. He had died 2 years later in a boarding house in St. Louis, still fighting the appeal, still believing justice was one more motion away. Olive had been at his bedside. She had held his hand. She had watched the belief go out of his eyes before the life did. After that she had worked. She had learned what she needed to learn. Land law, survey documents, how claims were filed and challenged, how fraud was structured. She had gotten a position with a Quaker relief organization out of Lawrence, Kansas, that was documenting the displacement of homesteader families across the southern plains, which gave her legitimate cover for her travel and her questions. But beneath the legitimate work was the private one, the systematic construction of a case against Harlan Cobb that she intended, when it was solid enough, to put in front of someone who could act on it. She had not yet found that someone. She had come close twice. Both times, the contacts she had made had quietly disappeared or changed their position, and she had come to understand that Cobb had reached into official structures that made official channels dangerous. She did not know about the deputy marshal working the Cimarron Crossing. She did not know that the quiet ferryman with dark eyes was exactly the connection she needed. But she was beginning, by the third week of October, to know that something about him was not straightforward. A ferryman on a backcountry crossing in southern Kansas in 1873 was typically an older man, usually someone who had come down from a harder life and was glad of the simple work. Isaac Dunlap was neither old nor broken. He was watchful in a specific way, the way trained men are watchful, and his hands were too quick and his stillness too deliberate to be entirely civilian. She was watching him the way he was watching her, and neither of them knew the other was doing it. The moment that broke the careful distance between them arrived on the 14th of October. It arrived in the form of a man named Vickers. Vickers appeared at the eastern bank in the early afternoon, riding a good horse and carrying himself with the particular confidence of a man who had authority he was willing to use. He was one of Cobb's agents, though Olive did not know this and Isaac did. He wore a dusty brown coat and had cold eyes, and he spoke to Olive at the landing while she was waiting for the ferry to return from the western bank. Isaac was watching from mid-river. He could not hear the exchange, but he could read the body language clearly enough. Vickers was pressing her about something. She was holding her ground, but the hand that was not holding her horse's lead rope was very still at her side, close to her holster, and that quality of stillness was the opposite of calm. He brought the ferry in faster than usual. He tied off and stepped onto the bank and walked to where they were standing without making it look like haste. Vickers looked at him with those cold eyes. "You the ferryman?" "I am," Isaac said. "I need passage." "You will need to wait," Isaac said pleasantly. "This lady is crossing first." Vickers looked at Olive. "We were having a conversation." "The conversation is finished," Olive said. Her voice was perfectly level, and that was its own kind of warning. Something moved across Vickers's face, the consideration of whether this was worth escalating, and then he settled back and the moment passed. He let Olive and her horse board the ferry without further comment, and Isaac took them across without hurrying, and when they reached the western bank, he looked at Olive directly for the first time that day. "Who is that man?" he asked quietly enough that it would not carry over the water. "I do not know his name," Olive said, "but he has approached me twice before and he wants to know what I have been writing in my ledger." Isaac filed this information in the part of his mind where significant things were kept. "Has he threatened you?" "Not in words," she said. He thought for a moment. "Would you be willing to tell me what is in the ledger?" She looked at him for a long time. The cottonwoods above the western bank were going gold in the October light, and the river ran dark and quick between the banks, and there was no sound except the water and the wind in the dry grass. "Not today," she said, "but perhaps soon." She led her horse up the bank. He watched her go. Then he turned the ferry around and went back for Vickers, and kept his face exactly as it had always been, open and unhurried and giving nothing away. But something had shifted. The invisible line between professional observation and something more personal had been crossed, and he knew it, and he was not sure he was sorry. 3 days later, Olive came to the crossing in the evening, after the regular traffic had ended and the light was going low and gold across the water. She came without her horse, and she was carrying her ledger in both hands, and she sat down on the log bench he kept at the eastern landing, and she said, without preamble, "I want to tell you about Harlan Cobb." He sat down on the other end of the bench and he listened. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She told him about her father and the fire and the 7 years of work since then. She told him about the families she had documented, the Pickerings and the Holloways and the Slade family and the Teagues and 11 more, each one a clear pattern of legal pressure followed by intimidation followed by destruction. She showed him the ledger. It was meticulous. Dates, names, claim numbers, survey challenges, payments made to law firms operating out of Dodge City, statements taken from displaced families. It was exactly the kind of documentation that the marshal's office had been trying to build from the other end. Isaac listened to all of it, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment looking at the river. He was at the point of decision. He understood that. He could feel the weight of it, the locked door in his professional conduct, and the key that telling her the truth would be. And on the other side of that door was a risk he had been trained to avoid, but a partnership that he increasingly believed would achieve more than either of them could alone. He also understood, sitting on that bench in the October twilight beside a woman who had spent 7 years of her life trying to get justice for her dead father, that what he felt for Olive Wainwright was no longer professionally manageable. It had not been, he admitted to himself, for some time. "I need to show you something," he said. He went to the ferry. He lifted the loose plank in the hull, the one he used as a dead drop, where he had been receiving communications from the marshal's office in Wichita. But the compartment was empty now, because he had moved the documents to his cabin after noting signs that someone had been near the ferry in his absence. He had not yet determined how to handle the security breach. He showed her the cabin instead. He showed her the documents he had accumulated, Cobb's Land Company filings, the list of agents including Vickers, the partial trail of payments. He showed her the warrant, unsigned as yet because they lacked direct evidence. He told her the truth about who he was. She sat across the small table in his cabin and read every document he put in front of her, and she was very quiet for a long time. "How long have you been here?" she finally asked. "Since August," he said. "And you knew what I was doing," she said. It was not quite an accusation, but it was not one either. "I suspected," he said. "I was not certain until tonight." She looked at him across the table, and the oil lamp between them made her gray eyes warm and complicated, and he met that look and did not look away. "You could have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I was wrong not to." The admission landed simply, without hedging, and she heard it as the thing it was, not an excuse, an acknowledgement. "My documentation is better than yours," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the vicinity of one. "Then we should combine them," she said. "Yes," he said again. She stayed at his table for another hour, going through the documents together, cross-referencing her ledger against his files, finding the connections. She was sharp and systematic and completely without sentimentality about the work, which he admired more than he could easily say. When she finally stood to leave, it was past 10 o'clock and the night had gone cold. He walked her to the door, and they stood for a moment in the doorway with the dark prairie stretching out behind her and the sound of the river in the distance. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He watched her walk away into the dark, carrying her ledger, and the feeling he had been managing for weeks settled around him like something he had stopped fighting. He acknowledged to himself, in considerable trouble. The following weeks were the best of Isaac's adult life, and the most dangerous, though for a while the danger felt manageable because the best part was so completely absorbing. He and Olive worked together with a focused efficiency that felt effortless in the way that things feel effortless when two people are genuinely matched. They had different strengths, and they knew it, and they used it. Her documentation of the victim families was exhaustive and precise. His knowledge of Cobb's legal structure and agent network gave them the framework to connect her evidence to the larger pattern. They worked in the evenings at his cabin, after the ferry traffic ended for the day. She would arrive with her ledger and her saddlebag of documents, and he would have coffee on the stove and the lamp trimmed, and they would sit across the table and build the case piece by piece. They fell into easy conversation that moved between the work and other things: her Quaker Relief Organization's work in the territory, his years as a deputy marshal, the particular quality of the Kansas autumn, the way the river changed color through the day. He learned that she was 26, had been born in October, loved horses with a quiet intensity, read whenever she could find books, had strong opinions about the displacement of the 5 civilized tribes from Indian Territory that she expressed without apology. She had been alone since her father died. There had been no man in her life. she told him once without self-pity, simply as a fact, because she had not had time and also because most men she encountered on the frontier were made uncomfortable by a woman who knew her own mind. "Does that bother you?" she asked him once. "A woman who knows her own mind." He looked at her from across the table where she was organizing survey documents with the same confident precision she brought to everything. "No," he said. "I find it essential." She looked up at him, and something passed between them, quick and warm and acknowledged by both, before they both looked back at their respective documents. He was 31 and had been careful with himself for a long time. He had learned on the frontier that feelings were expensive, and that the work he did not mix well with entanglements. He had also learned, as October gave way to November and Olive Wainwright sat across from him night after night building something important out of old grief and careful work, that the frontier's lessons, however hard-earned, were not the final word. On the third day of November, something changed in the field that forced everything to accelerate. A man named Dorsey, who was the county clerk in Meade and who had been quietly providing information to the marshal's office about Cobb's legal filings, was found dead. The official account was an accident, a fall from his horse on a night ride. Isaac received a coded message from Marshal Totham that same morning, delivered through the mail rider who stopped at the crossing twice a week. The message said, "Cobb knows about the investigation. Move to close or abandon." Isaac read the message twice. He burned it. He stood at the window of his cabin for a long time looking out at the river. Then he sent a message of his own back to Wichita. "Evidence is sufficient. Warrant ready to execute. Request immediate backup." He did not tell Olive about Dorsey's death that morning. He told himself he was protecting her from unnecessary fear, and there was truth in that. But there was also truth in the simpler fact that he did not want to see her face when she heard it, because she had spoken of Dorsey once as a brave man doing a quiet good thing, and he knew what it would cost her. He told her that evening. She sat very still for a moment when he told her. Then she asked, in a voice from which she had removed all trembling, "Was it Cobb's men?" "I believe so," he said. She nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when she had received information and was incorporating it into her understanding of things. Then she looked at him and her gray eyes were bright with an old, familiar fury. "Then we need to be faster," she said. "Yes," he said, "and we need to be careful." "Yes," he said, "and there is one thing I need you to understand." He told her about Vickers and about his belief that Vickers had been surveilling the crossing. He told her that the loose plank in the ferry hull had been identified as a communication point, which was why someone had stuffed an oilskin-wrapped letter into it that morning, a letter addressed to him in care of Harlan Cobb's name, which was a test or a trap or both. He had found it before Olive had, or so he had believed. But Olive had found it first. He knew that now. She had found it at dawn and spent the morning wrestling with what it meant before she came to him with a gun in her hand, and he could not be angry about that because if their positions had been reversed, he would have done exactly the same. "The letter was a trap," he said. "Cobb or his men planted it to see how I would respond. If I passed it along, it confirmed I was Cobb's man. If I destroyed it and acted anxious, it confirmed I was law. The correct response was to act as though I had never found it. And now Cobb knows you did not respond to it," Olive said. "Yes." "How much time do we have before he moves on you?" Isaac considered this honestly. "Days," he said. "Perhaps less." She absorbed this. She looked at her hands on the table. He watched her and thought about how she had pressed a gun against his chest that morning, and how her hands were completely steady when she did it. And he thought about all the small things he had been learning about her over these weeks. The way she touched her horse's nose when she was thinking. The way she held her coffee cup with both hands in the cold. The way she had looked at him on the ferry in the first days before either of them had said anything honest. And he understood that he had reached the moment that certain things could not wait for a safer time. "Olive," he said. She looked up. "When this is finished," he said, and then he stopped because what he was trying to say was large and he was accustomed to economy with words. She waited, which was one of the things she did that undid him. "When this is finished," he said again, "I would like to know what comes next for you." Her expression did something careful and then something less careful. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "I mean," he said, "that you have spent 7 years working towards something that I believe we are close to completing together. And when it is done, I would like to ask if you might be willing to spend some time discovering what else there is between us, if there is anything." She looked at him for a long time with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. Ask me when it is done," she said. "Ask me properly." "I will," he said. She nodded and they both looked back at the documents, but the quality of the air in the small cabin had changed, and when their hands reached for the same paper at the same moment and touched, neither of them moved away immediately. The backup from Wichita arrived on the 6th of November, 2 days after Isaac's urgent message. They came in 3 pairs, traveling separately and checking in at different points along the Cimarron to avoid drawing attention. Marshal Totham himself did not come, but he sent his senior deputy, a tall man named Aldous, who arrived at the crossing disguised as a cattle buyer and spent 30 minutes in Isaac's cabin reviewing everything Isaac and Olive had assembled. He looked at Olive's ledger for a long time and then he looked at her. "This is thorough," he said. "Thank you," she said. "This documentation of the victim families is more complete than anything the marshal's office has," Aldous said. He looked at Isaac. "Who is she?" "She is the reason we have a case," Isaac said simply. Aldous accepted this. He was a practical man who had been in law enforcement long enough to know that good evidence came from unexpected places, and that the source's gender was irrelevant to its validity. The plan they developed over the next 2 hours was this. Cobb was known to be traveling from Dodge City to his operation in the Comanche County region in approximately 3 days, using the Cimarron Crossing as his route. He had used it twice before under a different name, but Olive had identified him in her documentation through a statement from one of the Meade County homestead families who had seen him in person. If he came through the crossing, they would take him there. If he diverted, 2 of the deputy pairs were positioned on alternate routes. Olive's role was the part that Isaac struggled with. She had the most complete knowledge of the case and her presence as a witness would be important. Aldous wanted her at the crossing when Cobb came through. Isaac wanted her as far from the crossing as safely possible. They argued about this quietly but thoroughly after Aldous had left. "You are not trying to protect the case," Olive said. "You are trying to protect me." "Both things can be true," he said. "Isaac." She stood facing him in the lamplight, and her expression was the one she wore when she had considered something fully and arrived at the only position she could honestly hold. "I have been working toward this for 7 years. My father died waiting for this. 12 families have lost their homes. I'm not going to be 3 miles away in a boarding house when Harlan Cobb is arrested." He looked at her. He looked at the set of her jaw and the steadiness in her eyes and the 7 years that lived behind them. "All right," he said. She exhaled. "Thank you. You stay back until he is secured," he said. "You do not approach him until Aldous has him in irons. That is the only condition." "Agreed," she said. He nodded. Then, because he was not yet able to say the larger thing that was pressing against the inside of his chest, he said the smaller thing instead. "I am glad you came to the crossing." She looked at him for a moment and something in her expression went soft briefly, in a way she quickly steadied against. "So am I," she said. On the 8th of November, Harlan Cobb came to the crossing. He came in the early afternoon, riding in a group of 4 with 2 outriders ahead and 1 behind. He was a big man, heavy in the chest, with a gray-streaked beard and expensive clothes that sat wrong on him the way expensive things sit on men who understand money better than they understand themselves. He rode a black horse, and he looked at the crossing the way he looked at everything, with a flat, assessing gaze that was calculating the value of every single thing in front of him. Isaac brought the ferry across for the lead outriders, who crossed first. He kept his face open and his manner easy. He charged them the fare, and noted that Cobb waited on the eastern bank while his men checked the western side, which spoke to a caution that had kept him operating for too long. Olive was in the cottonwoods on the western bank, 40 yards back, with two of Aldous' deputies. She was not visible from the water. Cobb crossed on the second run, with his rear outrider, and Isaac stood at the guide rope and worked the ferry across with the same steady, unhurried rhythm he used every day, and the Cimarron moved around the flat hull, and the western bank came closer. He watched Cobb from his peripheral vision and thought about what this man had done, the breadth of it, the deliberateness of it, the families displaced, the documents forged, the man in Meade who had fallen from his horse, and Thomas Wainwright in a boarding house in St. Louis holding an appeal that was never going to succeed, and Olive at 19 watching her father diminish. He thought about all of it, and he kept his face exactly as it had always been. When the ferry touched the western bank, Aldous and 3 deputies emerged from the high grass on the bank's edge and had Harlan Cobb in irons before his horse could react. The rear outrider reached for his weapon and was covered by 2 rifles before the motion completed. Cobb's lead outriders on the western bank, who had been watching for trouble from the east, found it suddenly and irrevocably behind them. The arrest took less than 4 minutes. It was the fastest 4 minutes of Isaac's professional life, and when it was done and Cobb was standing on the western bank with his hands secured and his big face gone gray with the specific shock of a man who has always believed himself untouchable, Isaac stepped off the ferry and turned toward the cottonwoods. Olive was already walking toward the bank. She was walking with the same deliberate, measured pace she always used, but her hands were shaking slightly at her sides, and he could see the effort it took her to keep her expression composed. She stopped about 10 feet from Harlan Cobb. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with no recognition in his eyes, because she had been a 19-year-old girl in Missouri, the only time he had been in the same place as the Wainwright family, and to a man like Cobb, one displaced homesteader's family was indistinguishable from any other. "My name is Olive Wainwright," she said. "Thomas Wainwright of Cooper County, Missouri was my father. You took his land and you burned his house, and he spent the last 2 years of his life trying to prove what you had done." Something moved in Cobb's face, a flicker of calculation, assessing threat, measuring what this moment might cost him. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. "You will not need to," Olive said. "I have 7 years of documentation that explains it precisely." She turned and walked back toward the cottonwoods. Isaac watched her until she stopped with her back to the clearing, and he saw her shoulders drop, saw the long breath she took, saw her hand come up and press briefly against her eyes. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to go to her immediately and say, "It is done, you did it, 7 years of work and you did it." But Aldous needed him for the next 10 minutes to manage the prisoners and confirm the chain of evidence, and he could not leave. He dealt with what needed dealing with, and then he walked across the clearing to the cottonwoods. Olive was sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the trees with her ledger in her hands and her hat pushed back on her head and her gray eyes very bright in a way that was not quite crying but was in the same territory. He sat down beside her. "It is done," he said. She nodded. She was looking at her hands. "Your father," he said, "would recognize what you built." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Ask me now," she said. He looked at her. "You said to ask you when it was done," she said. "Ask me properly." He understood. He turned on the log to face her more fully, and he took her hands in his, ledger and all, and he held them and he said, "Olive Wainwright, I have been watching you cross my river for 6 weeks, and I have understood for most of that time that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life. I would like to know if you would be willing to let me keep knowing you. Beyond this river, beyond this case, for as long as you are willing." She looked at him with the gray eyes that had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her. "That was not a very poetic proposal," she said. "I am not a very poetic man," he said. "No," she said. "You are better than that. You are a very honest one." She turned her hands over in his so that they were holding his hands rather than being held by them. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and complete, and it landed inside Isaac's chest like something coming home. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he lifted her hands briefly to his mouth and pressed them against his lips, and she leaned her head sideways against his shoulder, and they sat there together at the edge of the cottonwoods, while Aldous organized the prisoner transport 30 yards away, and the Cimarron River moved past below them, indifferent as ever. Harlan Cobb was transported to Wichita under federal custody on the 9th of November. He was charged with land fraud, conspiracy, destruction of property, and federal violations related to false survey filings across 3 counties of southern Kansas and the northern Indian Territory. The case went to the federal court in Wichita the following spring, and the documentation that Olive had assembled over 7 years proved to be as solid as it was meticulous. 14 of the displaced families received legal remedy for their claims. Cobb was convicted the following September, sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, and the land company he had operated was dissolved by court order. Olive was not present at the sentencing. She had submitted her documentation by then, and the federal prosecutor had taken her testimony and told her that her evidence was the central pillar of the case, which she received without visible satisfaction, because for her the work had never been about satisfaction. It had been about completion, about the thing that had been broken being acknowledged, even if it could not be repaired. She heard about the sentence in a letter from Marshal Aldous on a Tuesday morning in March of 1874, at the kitchen table of a small house on the western edge of a town called Clarendon, 18 miles west of the Cimarron Crossing. Isaac had bought the house in December. He had bought it with the money from the ferry, which he had sold to Garrett's younger son after his assignment ended, and with the savings he had been keeping for something he had not been able to name until Olive made it nameable. It was a modest house, 2 rooms expanded to 3 by a previous owner who had added a bedroom at the back, with a covered porch that looked out over the dry grass of the prairie, and a barn large enough for 4 horses, which had seemed important when he bought it because the roan horse that Olive had been nursing for 3 months had finally made a full recovery from its stone bruise, and she needed space for it. He had proposed properly in December, which is to say he had proposed with a ring, a simple silver band that he had bought from a jeweler in Meade after 3 visits to the shop in which he had looked at various rings with increasing conviction before settling on the plainest and most honest one. He had not made a large occasion of it. He had given her the ring on the porch of the house on a cold December evening with the stars very thick and close overhead, and she had looked at it for a long moment, and then put it on, and then looked at him with an expression that contained the full complexity of a person who has learned not to expect good things and finds one arriving anyway. "Is this the right size?" he asked because he had guessed. "It is perfect," she said. They had married in January 1874 at the county courthouse in Meade, with Deputy Marshal Aldous as a witness on Isaac's side and a woman named Clara Pettigrew, who ran the Quaker Relief Organization that Olive worked for, as her witness. It was a practical ceremony in keeping with 2 practical people, but when the clerk asked if he wished to state anything before the vows, and Isaac turned to Olive and said, quietly but fully audibly, that she was the bravest person he had ever known, and that he considered it the primary good fortune of his life that she had come to his river, Clara Pettigrew made a sound that was unambiguously a sob and had to search for her handkerchief. Isaac left the marshal's service formally in February 1874. He had been offered a permanent position out of Wichita, and he had declined it, not without gratitude, because he understood that the life he wanted was not the one that required him to be a long way from home for long stretches of time. He was not done with useful work, but he had concluded that the most useful work he could do did not require a badge. He took a position with the county land office in Meade as a survey investigator, using his knowledge of fraud methods to review contested claims and identify irregularities. It was quieter than deputying and more regular, and it meant he was home most evenings, which mattered more than he had expected. He was, he discovered, a man built for domestic life in ways the frontier had not given him space to know. Olive continued her work with the Quaker Relief Organization, now from a more settled base, making regular trips into the surrounding county to document displaced families and connect them with resources. She was building, she told him one evening, a more permanent structure, something that could outlast her individual involvement, a regional organization with formal standing that could advocate for homesteaders through legal channels. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings, and she was formidable, and he admired her daily. The spring of 1874 was warm and early, and the Cimarron ran high with snowmelt from the mountains to the west, and the prairie around Clarendon turned green before April. They kept a kitchen garden, and Olive turned out to know a great deal about gardening, having grown up with her mother's kitchen garden in Missouri, and she approached it with the same focused energy she brought to documentation work, with the result that by June they had more vegetables than two people could eat. Isaac found that he was happy in a way he could not have described precisely, but recognized clearly, the way you recognize a road you have never taken but have always been traveling toward. He was useful in his work. He was home in the evenings. He was married to a woman who argued with him, challenged him, made him better at thinking, pressed her cold feet against his legs in the night, and looked at him sometimes across the kitchen table with those gray eyes in a way that made the whole length of his life before seem like preparation. In late June, Olive told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before he left for the county office, standing in the kitchen doorway with her coffee in both hands and a particular expression that was neither the fierce focus of her work nor the softer look she reserved for him alone, but something new, something more complicated and quieter, something he had not seen before. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her carefully, as if she were something extraordinary that required gentle handling, and she laughed against his chest, the fullest laugh he had heard from her, and said, "I am not made of glass, Isaac." "I know," he said. "I am not trying to protect you. I am just—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "Overwhelmed," he said. She pulled back to look at his face. His expression was one she had not seen on him before either, an openness that the careful man he was did not usually allow himself, something bright and afraid and grateful all at once. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "I am also overwhelmed," she said. "I think that is the appropriate response." He laughed, which was also fuller and less careful than usual, and she reached up and put her palm against his jaw, and they stood together in the kitchen doorway with the morning light coming in. The child arrived in February 1875 during a cold snap that blew hard from the north and packed the windows with frost. He was born healthy and loud, with dark hair like his father's and a furious energy from the first moment that suggested he had inherited something from both sides. They named him Thomas, after Olive's father. Clara Pettigrew came from Meade to help, and Aldous sent a congratulatory letter from Wichita when the news reached him. And the roan horse, whom Olive had named Prospect in honor of the direction she had always been traveling, was insufferably interested in the new smell coming from the house and had to be firmly redirected on multiple occasions. Isaac held his son for the first time and sat with him in the chair by the bedroom window and felt the settled weight of a life that had arrived at something real. He looked at Olive, who was watching him from the bed with the exhausted, fiercely satisfied expression of a woman who had done something enormous and knew it. "He has your stubbornness," Isaac told her. "Good," she said. "He will need it." The spring of 1875 brought changes to the county. The railroad was advancing steadily across southern Kansas, and with it came a new wave of settlement that brought both opportunity and the familiar problems of rapid land acquisition, false filings, and desperate families. Isaac's work at the county land office became more demanding and more important, and Olive's regional organization, which she had officially incorporated the previous autumn with Clara Pettigrew as co-director, began handling dozens of cases a month. They were busy. They were, in the particular way of people who have found work that matters and a life that holds, deeply alive. Isaac had not entirely left the river behind. He went back to the crossing occasionally, when his survey work took him east into that part of the county, and he would stand at the bank and look at the Cimarron moving through its familiar course, and think about the September morning when a woman had arrived on the eastern bank leading a lame horse, and looked at him with those gray eyes that missed nothing. He thought about what the river had been witness to. The morning with the gun and the warrant. The evenings building a case over a lamplit table. The moment in the cottonwoods that had changed the course of both their lives. He thought about what it meant that Olive, who was afraid of nothing that he had ever observed, had still been shaking when she walked toward Cobb after the arrest, and how she had pressed her hand against her eyes in the cottonwoods, and how when she had looked at him and said, "Ask me now," she had also been trusting him with a vulnerability she did not show anyone else. He was, he thought, on the better side of the river now. And so was she. The house in Clarendon expanded in the spring of 1876, when Isaac and a neighbor named Forsyth built a proper second bedroom onto the east side and a covered addition to the barn. The expansion was made necessary by the arrival of another child in November 1875, a daughter they named Ada, who had Olive's gray eyes and the fine auburn traces of Olive's hair, and was, from the first weeks of her life, possessed of an absolute certainty about her own preferences that made Isaac look at his wife with an expression of helpless recognition. "That is entirely from you," he told Olive. "I am choosing to accept that as a compliment," she said. Thomas was 10 months old when Ada arrived, and he received her with the serious curiosity of a very young person, confronting something new and important. He was walking by then, unsteadily but with great conviction, and he spent considerable time circling his sister's basket and looking at her with an expression that settled, over a period of weeks, from uncertainty into proprietorship. Olive watched her children with the particular attention she brought to everything she valued, which was thorough and undemonstrative and deep. She had not known, she told Isaac one evening, that she had this in her. The particular love of this kind, the domestic, daily, incremental love. She had been so long in motion, working towards something, that she had not known whether she could be still enough for it. "You are not still," Isaac pointed out. "You ran 3 cases through the organization this week. You are writing the legislative proposal, and you drove out to the Callaway claim on Tuesday." She considered this. "I mean still in here," she said, placing her hand briefly over her chest. He understood. "Are you?" he asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table, which was still the center of their life, covered now with his survey maps on one side and her organization papers on the other and Thomas's toy horse perpetually in between. "Yes," she said, "mostly. Sometimes the old anger comes back when I hear about a new case that looks like Cobb's pattern." "That is not restlessness," he said. "That is you," she smiled. It was the full smile, not the small controlled one she used in public, but the one she kept for him and for the children, which transformed her face completely. "Are you happy?" she asked him. "Olive," he said. "I want to hear you say it," she said. He met her eyes. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, "by a distance that is very difficult to measure." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked down and went back to her legislative proposal, but the smile stayed. In the summer of 1876, a significant thing happened at the Cimarron Crossing. Isaac's old ferry, now operated by Garrett's son Ned, was swept away in a flash flood caused by heavy storms in late July. The crossing was temporarily impassable, which caused significant disruption to the regular traffic and brought the subject of the crossing to the attention of the county commissioners. There had been intermittent discussion for some years about building a permanent bridge at the crossing point, and the flood damage renewed that conversation seriously. Isaac was asked to serve on the committee that evaluated the bridge proposal, which he accepted, partly because his survey expertise was genuinely useful to the evaluation, and partly because it gave him an excuse to spend time at the river, which he still found himself drawn to with a regularity that Olive found amusing. "You miss it," she said. "I miss parts of it," he said. "Which parts?" He thought about this honestly. "The particular quality of being in the middle of the river," he said. "Between the two banks, you can see both sides from there." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he recognized as one of the deeper ones, the ones that were about more than what was said. "You were always going to end up on one bank or the other," she said. "I know," he said. "I chose the right one." She reached across the table and took his hand. They sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet of the kitchen, while their children slept, and the summer moved slow and golden outside the window. The bridge committee recommended construction. The Cimarron Crossing Bridge was funded by the county in 1877 and built that summer, a solid timber structure supported by stone piers, designed to handle heavy wagon traffic and the periodic rise of the river. Isaac surveyed the crossing site and provided the foundational measurements, and was present at the bridge's completion in October. He stood at the center of the bridge on a clear October morning, looking down at the Cimarron moving under his feet. The light was the same quality it had been in the autumn of 1873, that clear, cold Kansas light that made everything look like itself, too defined and real to be romantic, and for that reason more beautiful than anything prettier would have been. He was aware of Olive standing beside him. She had come out from Clarendon with Thomas, now nearly 3 and possessed of an authority over his own movements that made him exhausting to accompany, and Ada, who was 11 months old and was held against Olive's hip with the easy comfort of constant practice. "This is where you found me," Olive said. "You found yourself," he said. "I just happened to be operating the ferry." She tilted her head. "That is very magnanimous. It is accurate." She looked at the river beneath the bridge, which was running low and clear in the October drought, the sandy bottom visible through 2 feet of water, deceptively gentle. "I was so angry when I came to this crossing the first time," she said. "I had just come from the Pickering family, 3 children. They had been in their house for 6 months. 6 months of work, and they had to leave in the night. She paused. "I was the angriest I had been since my father died, and I had been angry for a very long time." "I know," he said. "And then I came to the bank and this man brought the ferry across without being asked," she said. "And he loaded my lame horse without making me feel grateful, which is very difficult to manage, and he would not take my fare." She paused again. "And I thought, that is either a very kind man or a man with hidden motives." "And which did you decide?" She looked at him. Ada reached out and grabbed a fistful of Isaac's coat, and he took hold of her small hand automatically, one of those gestures of parenthood that have no conscious decision behind them. "I decided," Olive said, "that I would keep crossing until I knew for certain. It took you several weeks. I was being careful." "You were not careful when you found the letter," he pointed out. "No," she agreed. "I was not. I went directly to the gun, which in retrospect was entirely reasonable," he said. She looked at him with a small, soft laugh. "You do not have to say that." "I mean it," he said. "Given everything you knew or suspected at that moment, pressing a gun against my chest was the proportionate response. I'm only glad you lowered it." "I lowered it," she said, "because when I looked at you, you were not afraid." "I was slightly afraid," he said. "You did not look afraid. That is a different matter." She laughed again, the full one. Thomas, who had been investigating the bridge railing with complete absorption, looked up at the sound of his mother's laugh and then went back to his railing. Isaac looked at his wife and his daughter and his son and the river below them, and thought, not for the first time, about the quality of luck that had sent him to this crossing, and not another, that had made him see a woman on the eastern bank and bring the ferry across without being asked, that had put the right 2 people on either side of the same problem, so that, when they finally combined what they knew, the result was something neither could have built alone. He thought about what Olive had said years ago, that she had not known whether she could be still enough for this kind of life. He thought about what she could not have known then, that she had always been still inside, that the stillness in her was the same quality as his own, the stillness of people who have learned to hold themselves very steady in the middle of a current. That was what the river had recognized in both of them. That was what he had seen in her before he understood it. "Let us go home," he said. She took his arm. Thomas detached himself from the railing and came to take his father's other hand, and they walked back across the new bridge together, the four of them, and the Cimarron moved beneath them, unimpressed and eternal, and the October sky was so clear and open above the Kansas plain that it looked like the beginning of everything. The years that followed the bridge's completion were the years of building, not in the ambitious, restless sense, but in the slow, solid sense of a life taking on depth. Isaac's position at the county land office grew into something more substantial as the region developed, and the legal structures around land ownership became more complex. He was recognized throughout the county as a man of exceptional integrity and practical expertise, and when the position of county surveyor came open in 1879, he was offered it by the commissioners with the kind of unanimous confidence that comes when there is genuinely only one correct answer. He accepted it. The work mattered and he was good at it, and it kept him grounded in the specific, factual nature of land, which he had always loved. The way a piece of ground is exactly what it is, the way its characteristics can be measured and recorded and made to tell a true story. Olive's regional organization, formerly named the Southern Kansas Homestead Defense Association, by 1878, had become one of the most effective of its kind in the territory. It operated with 4 full-time staff members and a network of volunteer correspondents, and had processed more than 200 cases in its first 3 years of formal operation. Clara Pettigrew remained co-director, and the two women made a formidable partnership, combining Olive's methodical legal documentation with Clara's organizational gifts and diplomatic fluency. The organization had also taken on advocacy work in the Indian Territory, documenting the ongoing displacement of Native families whose land rights were being violated by the same patterns of legal fraud that had been used against white homesteaders, which was a more complicated and more dangerous cause, and one that Olive pursued with full awareness of its complexity and no reduction of her commitment to it. She was not naive about the injustice that ran through the territory in every direction, that the 5 civilized tribes had themselves been displaced by the government that was now supposed to protect the homesteaders they were being displaced by, and that the full accounting of what was owed to whom in this land was a debt that could not be easily calculated or paid. She said this plainly in her advocacy documents, and it was one of the things that made her work genuinely different from the more narrow homesteader advocacy of many of her contemporaries. Isaac understood and supported this dimension of her work without reservation. His years as a deputy marshal had taken him into the territory many times, and he had seen enough to understand that the injustice was not incidental to the frontier's development but structural to it, and that acknowledging it honestly was the only honest position, whatever its complications. They argued sometimes, not about principles but about tactics and practicalities, which was the arguing of two people who share values and not methods, and those arguments were some of Isaac's favorite conversations, because Olive at full intellectual speed was something he never tired of. Their third child arrived in March 1879. It was another son, born in the earliest spring when the weather was still cold and uncertain, but the days were beginning to lengthen. They named him James, for no particular reason except that it was a name they both liked and that sat well with Thomas and Ada, and James arrived in the world with a placidity that surprised them both after the intensity of his siblings, a steady, observant quality that settled into the household like a ballast. Thomas, who was 4 and already possessed of strong opinions about the order of things, received his new brother with a proprietary satisfaction that Isaac found privately hilarious. Ada, 2.5, received him with the focused attention of a person cataloging something new, and then resumed her primary activities, which at that point consisted largely of attempting to ride Prospect and being redirected with varying degrees of success. Olive recovered from James's birth more easily than from the previous two and was back at her desk within 10 days, which Isaac did not encourage but had learned not to oppose, because opposition served no purpose and she was better at knowing her own body's limits than he was at knowing them for her. "You could rest longer," he said on the 11th morning. "I am resting," she said. "I am sitting down." "You are writing a legal brief." "Sitting while writing a legal brief," she said, without looking up. He laughed and put coffee next to her and went to the barn to check on the horses, which was as close to a concession as either of them was likely to manage. The summer of 1879 was dry and hot, and the community of Clarendon and the surrounding homesteads were under the pressure of a second consecutive drought year. Isaac worked the land office and rode the survey lines, and tried to help families find legal stability in a period when the physical land itself was offering very little. Olive ran crisis response through the association, connecting drought-affected families with relief resources and helping them maintain their claims through the dry year. They were tired in the particular way of people doing hard and necessary work in difficult conditions, and the tiredness was not resentment because the work was chosen and meaningful, but it was real. They leaned on each other in the practical way of two people who have learned over years how to support weight without words. He knew when she needed him to take the children for the afternoon without being asked. She knew when the county work was eating at him and would come and sit near him at the table in the evenings just to be there. They had built, over 6 years of marriage, the particular language of two people who have decided to understand each other fully, which was not always graceful and was not always smooth, but was always true. On their 6th wedding anniversary in January 1880, Isaac found Olive standing on the porch in the cold, looking south across the winter prairie. The children were asleep. It was late and very quiet, and the stars were very bright and the grass was silver with frost. He came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My father," she said. He was quiet. "Not sadly," she said. "I was thinking about what he would think of all of this, of the children, of the organization, of you." She paused. "He would have liked you very much." "I am glad," Isaac said. "He was stubborn and honest," she said, "and he believed that things could be made right if you worked hard enough and told the truth loudly enough. He was wrong about some things, the world being fairer than it is, justice being closer than it is, but he was not wrong about the working and the truth-telling. He just ran out of time." "You did not," Isaac said. She looked at him. "You had time," he said, "and you used it, and the thing he was trying to do, you did." She was quiet for a moment. The frost-cold air moved between them and the stars hung overhead in their indifferent abundance. "I know," she said. "I know that, I feel it." She turned to look at him fully. "I feel it most when I look at you." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned against him, which she did not do with people she did not trust absolutely, and which she did with him so naturally now that it felt like the most ordinary thing in the world, and also still like a gift. "6 years," she said. "Yes. That first crossing," she said, "when you brought the ferry across before I asked. I saw you coming from the middle of the river," he said. "I could see the horse was lame from 50 yards. That was not why," she said. He thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "that was not why," she smiled. It was the full smile in the dark, and he felt it more than saw it. "I am glad you came across," she said. "I am glad you let me," he said. They stood together on the porch in the cold January night, and the prairie spread around them in all directions, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the house, their 3 children slept in the particular deep stillness of children who are safe and warm, and the life they had built together held them as completely as anything made of work and truth and love can hold 2 people. In the spring of 1880, Olive received a letter from the federal court in Wichita informing her that Harlan Cobb, having served nearly 7 years of his 12-year sentence, had applied for early release. The letter was courtesy notification from the prosecutor's office, which had maintained contact with her as the primary documentation witness in the original case. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and then she set it down and sat with it. Isaac came in from the barn and found her sitting very still in the particular way she sat when something required full processing. "What is it?" he asked. She gave him the letter. He read it. "He will not get early release," Isaac said. "The case record is too complete. The convictions are clean." "I know," she said. "I know that intellectually." "But," he said. She looked at her hands. "I spent so long being afraid of him," she said. "Even after the arrest, even after the conviction, I would hear his name and feel it, that old cold feeling. It has been years since I felt it, and then I read his name in this letter," and she stopped. "It came back," Isaac said. "Briefly," she said. "Briefly it came back." He sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly, the way he had always looked at her, with that total, unhurried attention that she had trusted from the first weeks at the ferry. "He has been in prison for 7 years," Isaac said. "The families have their claims back. The land company is dissolved. Your organization has helped 200 families. Your father's case is in the court record and his name is there, and what was done to him is documented in federal court as a crime. And you are sitting at this table in a house that is yours, and you have 3 children and work that matters," and he paused. "And he cannot touch any of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a slow, full breath. "I know," she said again, but this time it meant something different. She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it. "You are very good to me," she said. "You make it easy," he said. She laughed, which was the response he had been aiming for, and the old cold feeling finished leaving, and she went back to the letter, and this time she read it with the clear eyes of a person who is not afraid. Cobb's application for early release was denied the following month. She received that letter too and read it, and filed it in the back of her document case, where it belonged, and did not think about it again for a very long time. Ada started school in the autumn of 1880, riding into Clarendon on her own small pony, with the combination of fierce independence and covert anxiety that characterized most things she undertook at 5 years old. Thomas, who was nearly 6, would have been starting too, except that he had spent the previous winter sick with a chest illness that had kept him home and set his schooling back by a year, and would start the following autumn. He was recovered fully by spring, and had spent the summer pursuing the activities of a recovered 5-year-old, with a level of energy that left both parents periodically breathless. James, at 1.5, was beginning to walk with the same placid determination that had characterized him from birth, going from one piece of furniture to the next with methodical patience, and occasionally looking up to check whether his movements had been observed and appreciated. The house in those years was full in every sense of the word, full of noise and need and small emergencies, and the particular daily texture of 3 small people discovering the world. Isaac moved through it with the steadiness that was native to him, and Olive moved through it with the focused energy that was native to her, and together they managed mostly, and on the days they did not manage perfectly, they handled it with the good humor of 2 people who have decided that imperfection is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be navigated. One evening in October 1881, Isaac came home from a long day of boundary survey work in the eastern county to find the kitchen in a state of considerable disorder. 2 of the 3 children in tears for reasons that were being explained to him simultaneously and therefore comprehensibly, and Olive standing at the stove with an expression of contained exhaustion and an apron that had clearly been the site of an incident involving flour. He stood in the doorway for a moment taking in the scene. Then he stepped in, removed the spoon from Olive's hand, kissed her once firmly on the cheek, and said to the children, "Outside, both of you, 10 minutes." They went. The kitchen became quiet. He finished what was on the stove, which was a stew that needed another 20 minutes, and poured a cup of water from the jug and handed it to Olive, who sat down at the table and drank it. "Better?" he asked. "Don't ask me that yet," she said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, better." He sat across from her. They listened to the children's voices outside, already at peace with whatever had been the matter, absorbed back into their own world with the terrifying resilience of children. "They had a spectacular argument about the ownership of a stick," Olive said. "A stick," he said. "It was apparently a specific and significant stick," she said. He looked at her with a steady expression for a moment, and then they both laughed, suddenly and thoroughly, and Olive put her face in her hands and kept laughing until the exhaustion had turned into something lighter, and Isaac watched her and thought, This is the thing. Not the dramatic moments, not the warrant on the table or the cottonwoods after the arrest. The ordinary evening, the flower on the apron, the argument about a stick, the laughing together in the kitchen over something that will not matter tomorrow. This is what the ferry crossing was in service of. This is what comes on the other side of the river. The fourth child arrived in June of 1883, another daughter, whom they named Ruth. By this point Thomas was 8, Ada 7, and James 4, and the new baby was received by all three with the resigned acceptance of children who have learned that younger siblings are a recurring feature of the landscape. Ruth was, from the beginning, very much like her mother, gray-eyed, direct, and possessed of opinions about everything. She screamed when she was unhappy and was silent and alert when she was content, and she looked at everything with a focused attention that Isaac recognized immediately. "She is watching," he said to Olive, when Ruth was 3 weeks old. "She has been watching since the first day," Olive said. "She is your daughter," he said. "She is also yours," Olive said. "She has your stubbornness." "I thought Thomas had my stubbornness." "They can both have it," Olive said. "There seems to be sufficient." He smiled and she smiled, and Ruth looked at both of them with her new gray eyes and assessed what she saw, storing it for future reference. By 1885, the house in Clarendon had been expanded twice more, and the barn accommodated 5 horses, 2 of which belonged to the children. Isaac was county surveyor and a man of standing in the community, not in the self-conscious way of men who pursue standing for its own sake, but in the natural way of a person who has done useful and honest work in the same place for long enough that the place has grown around him. Olive's organization, the Southern Kansas Homestead Defense Association, had grown into a regional institution with affiliate offices in 4 counties, and a budget maintained by a combination of Quaker organizational support, private donation, and a small annual appropriation from the county commission that had been the result of 3 years of focused advocacy by Olive herself. She remained its most visible face and its most effective advocate, and she had been asked twice to testify before the Kansas state legislature on land fraud reform, both times producing testimony that was described by legislative observers as among the most precise and complete they had encountered. She was, at 38, fully herself in a way that the frontier rarely permitted women to be. She had not compromised who she was into a shape that fit better, had not traded her directness for social ease or her professional ambitions for domestic peace, and she had been able to be fully herself in part, because Isaac Dunlap had never asked her to be otherwise, had in fact required nothing of her except honesty, and had given the same in return. He thought about this sometimes in the ordinary way that a man thinks about the essential conditions of his life. He thought about it on the evenings he came home to find her at the kitchen table with her papers, the children doing their lessons or their arguing or their playing in the other room, the stove putting out its steady heat, the house full of the accumulated particular warmth of a family that has been built by 2 people who mean it. He thought, "I have been very lucky." And then, more precisely, no, not lucky. Lucky implies an accident. This is what happens when 2 people who are genuinely suited to each other manage to find each other, and then choose each other repeatedly, every day, for years. In September of 1885, Isaac took Thomas, who was 10, out to the Cimarron Crossing for the first time. Thomas had heard the story, in the versions that children of 10 hear, that his father had been a ferryman and his mother had crossed the river and they had met there, and built a case together and caught a bad man. He had the 10-year-old's version of this narrative, which was largely about the gun and the bad man and somewhat less about the complicated human dimensions. They stood on the bridge together and looked at the river. "This is where you met Mama?" Thomas asked. "She came to the eastern bank with a lame horse," Isaac said. "I was on the ferry in the middle of the river and I could see she had been walking a long way." "Did you know who she was?" "Not yet," Isaac said. "I just knew that she needed to cross and that the horse needed loading carefully." Thomas considered this. "And then you fell in love." Isaac looked at the river. The Cimarron was running low and clear in the September heat, as it had been that other October morning when they had stood on the new bridge together for the first time with Ada on Olive's hip and Thomas's hand in his. The sandy bottom was visible, deceptively shallow-looking. "Over time," he said. "We talked. We worked together. We came to know each other. And yes, over time." "Mama says you had a gun pointed at you." "She mentioned that," Isaac said. "Were you scared?" He thought about this honestly. "A little," he said, "but mostly I was thinking about how to explain myself clearly so that she would understand the situation." Thomas looked at him with the particular expression of a child who is deciding whether to believe something. "You were also thinking she was very brave," Thomas said, with the assurance of someone who has heard the adult version of the story from the other party. Isaac smiled. "Yes," he said, "I was thinking that too." They stood on the bridge for a while longer and then walked back to where Prospect's replacement, a steady bay gelding named Charter, was tied to a post on the western bank, and they rode back to Clarendon together through the September afternoon, and the Cimarron ran behind them in the long light. The autumn of 1885 brought the thing that had been approaching for some years in the way that certain recognitions approach, gradually and then suddenly. Olive's organization had been building toward a major legislative push for a revised state land fraud statute that would strengthen penalties and streamline enforcement, and the push reached its culmination in a November session in Topeka, at which Olive was the primary expert witness. She was gone for a week. Isaac managed the house and the children, which he did with the capable equanimity of a man who had been equal partner in the domestic life of his family for 11 years, and found nothing either remarkable or beneath him about it. The children had their routines and he followed them. There were meals and lessons and arguments and Thomas's stubbornness and Ada's intensity and James's steady placidity and Ruth's gray-eyed assessment of everything. And by the third day, Isaac had settled into the rhythm of it entirely. He wrote to Olive every evening. He told her about the children's days and about the boundary survey he was conducting in the western reaches of the county, and about the first frost that arrived on the fourth morning, and about the way James, now 6, had discovered a deep interest in how things were built, and had spent an entire afternoon studying the construction of the porch railing with the absorbed concentration of a future engineer. Olive wrote back from Topeka, describing the legislative chambers and the committee session, and the particular tension of presenting evidence before lawmakers who were simultaneously interested in doing the right thing and afraid of the cost of doing it. She wrote about being away from home and how her hotel room was perfectly adequate, and the food was perfectly adequate, and the whole city was perfectly adequate, but that it did not have the sound the house had at night, the particular quiet that had a family's warmth inside it. He read that letter 3 times. She came home on a Saturday afternoon, arriving by the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe rail line at the Meade station, which Isaac had driven out to meet. She stepped off the train in her practical coat with her document satchel over her shoulder and her hat slightly askew from travel, and when she saw him at the platform, she walked toward him in that direct, purposeful way that was entirely her, and he met her halfway, and she walked into his arms without ceremony, which was the version of homecoming that belonged to people who have been together long enough that the grand gesture has given way to something simpler and truer. "How did it go?" he asked into her hair. "Very well," she said. "Have enough support for the bill to pass in the spring session." "I am not surprised," he said. She pulled back to look at him. "How are the children?" "Ruth found a frog," he said. "Of course she did," Olive said. "Thomas tried to teach James how to play chess, and they had a significant disagreement about the rules of the night." "Also not surprising. Ada read an entire book in one day and wrote a summary of it that is more thorough than most reports I see at the county office." Olive smiled, the full one. "She is alarming," she said. "She is exactly like you," he said. They collected her satchel and walked to where Charter was waiting and drove back to Clarendon through the November afternoon. And the house, when they arrived, was full of children and noise, and the smell of the soup that James had apparently decided to contribute to dinner by himself, which had resulted in an excess of salt and required some diplomatic management. And Olive stood in the middle of the kitchen and took it all in with the particular quality of a person returning to the specific place they belong. She looked at Isaac across the children's heads. "I missed this," she said. "I know," he said. "We missed you." The land fraud bill passed the Kansas state legislature in the spring session of 1886, substantially as Olive had proposed it, with strengthened penalties for fraudulent survey filings and a formalized process for displaced homesteaders to challenge improper claims. It was signed by the governor in April. The Southern Kansas Homestead Defense Association was cited in the bill's preamble as the primary source of the documentation that had justified the reform. Isaac read the bill in the newspaper on the morning it was reported and brought the paper to Olive at the kitchen table without comment. She read it and was very quiet for a moment. Then she put the paper down and looked out the window at the April morning, the new green coming into the prairie grass, the sky wide and pale blue above the flat land. "Your father," Isaac said. She nodded once. "This is what he was trying to do," Isaac said. "He was trying to make it harder to do what was done to him. He ran out of time. You did not." She looked at him and there were tears in her eyes, which was not an expression he had seen often, and it landed in him the way rare things do. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying it exactly right," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat together in the morning light, while the children made their morning sounds from the other rooms, and the prairie lay bright and open beyond the window, and the life they had built from both their histories held them as completely and as practically as anything true can hold two people who have decided to hold it together. In the years that followed, the story settled into what good stories settle into when they are truly resolved. Not silence, not stasis, but the deep and generative continuity of lives that have found their shape. Thomas grew into a young man of 14, then 15, then 16, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's relentless practicality, and a native interest in law that no one was particularly surprised by. Ada read everything and debated everything and showed, by the time she was 12, a quality of analytical mind that Clara Pettigrew told Olive, only half joking, would make her the finest legal advocate in the region within 20 years. James built things. He built the fence on the east side of the barn at 9 years old with minimal adult supervision, and it was straight and solid, and Isaac inspected it with the professional eye of a surveyor and found nothing to correct. Ruth watched and assessed and spoke with authority on subjects she had decided she understood, which at 7 years old was essentially all subjects. The house was full of who they were. It was not a quiet house or a simple house, but it was a true one, built by two people who had each come to it with history and grief and purpose, who had found in each other not a solution to those things but a companion for them, and who had made from the combination something larger than either had been building alone. In the summer of 1889, the Kansas state legislature received a petition for the formal establishment of what would become Oklahoma Territory to the south, opening the Indian Territory lands to homestead settlement, An event that brought Olive back to her desk with focused urgency. Because the opening of those lands without adequate legal protection for existing indigenous residents was precisely the kind of structural injustice she had spent her career documenting. And she intended to be in Topeka when the related legislation was debated, with documentation. Isaac drove her to the Meade rail station on a July morning, the two of them alone for the first time in days, Charter moving at his steady pace through the summer heat. "How long?" he asked. "2 weeks, probably," she said. "Possibly 3." He nodded. She looked at him. "You are making the face," she said. "I do not have a face," he said. "You have a very specific face," she said. "That means you are managing your feelings about something and would prefer not to be asked about them directly." He drove in silence for a moment. Then, "I do not like you being away." "I know," she said. "I know that you need to be there and that the work matters and that I am not asking you not to go." "I know that too," she said. "I simply wanted to say it out loud," he said, "so that it is said and not managed." She leaned over and pressed her cheek briefly against his shoulder, which was the gesture she used when words were insufficient, and he covered her hand with his for a moment. "3 weeks at most," she said. "3 weeks," he agreed. She went. She testified. The legislation was modified to include provisions she had argued for, imperfect, but better than what had been proposed. And she came home after 2.5 weeks on a September evening when the light was low and gold, and the children had been watching the road for 2 hours. Ruth, now 6, ran to meet the wagon at the end of the track and was scooped up by her mother before the wagon had fully stopped. James came next, then Ada, then Thomas, who at 14 came at a walk but with an expression of uncomplicated relief that he would have denied feeling if asked. Isaac brought the wagon to the hitching post and took Olive's satchel and looked at her standing in the middle of her children, holding Ruth with one arm and Ada's hand with the other, Thomas and James around her, and the evening light making everything amber and warm. She looked up at him over Ada's head. He looked back at her. Everything that had passed between them on this and every other river, every crossing they had made from one place to another, every document assembled and every case built, and every night at the kitchen table, and every child born and every argument conducted, and every evening stood on some bank or bridge looking at water moving between what was known and what was still becoming, everything gathered into the look they shared in that moment, which was not a dramatic moment and was therefore the truest kind. She smiled. He smiled back. The Cimarron ran 30 miles to the east over its stone bridge in the early autumn light, indifferent as ever. It had seen what it needed to see. The ferryman who never charged her fare, the most fearless woman at the crossing, both of them standing finally on the same bank, in the middle of a life that was exactly what they had made it, difficult, meaningful, honest, and deeply, practically, irrevocably full of love.